Hello, 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 ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of Faith Unaltered. I'm your host, David Russell, and I am joined by my good friend from Canada, Dale Glover. How you doing, Dale?
I'm doing good, David. How are you?
Good, good. How's the red cream soda?
It's always great. It's always the best that way. So, yeah, I'm
Yeah, we
looking
don't have.
looking forward to. Oh, God.
No, go ahead, buddy.
I was looking forward to today. Yeah, just gonna say I'm looking forward to today's show. So, great to be a co-host to hear Ben's take here. So, yeah.
Oh yeah, um, guys, we have a special guest tonight, and you've seen him before. And if you don't know him, then you haven't been watching the show, and probably aren't subbed. So might as well sub if you're here watching us now. But his name is Ben Watkins. He is the host of a Real Atheology. How you doing, Ben? Oh, you're on mute, bud.
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man, it's always a pleasure. You're my fellow statesman. We're both Virginians here, so it's always good to have a fellow statesman on, as we say, right?
Absolutely, a commonwealth. We're
Yes,
we're a
right,
different, we're a different breed.
right, right. Some of us,
I feel
some
like I'm
people call
being
us the
ganged up
communist wealth. Some people call us the communist wealth, but I don't think
Yeah,
it's quite right.
I somehow feel
So
like the
yeah,
odd man out now.
well, you're
Go
from
ahead, man.
Canada. You're always the odd man out. So
Thanks.
I'm just joking, buddy. I'm just joking. So first, Dale, I'm gonna ask you real quick, what's going on with Real Seekers? What are you up to recently?
Yeah. So this week, just yesterday, I did. Well, actually, I posted two shows this week so far. So I posted a show on Eastern Orthodoxy and looking at the issue of the biblical canon and assessing their claims to see if are they warranted in telling which books are canonical or inspired and infallible or not. And just yesterday, I had Dr. Thomas McAvoy on the show. He's written a book called God the Geometer, and it's kind of exploring the relationship between science and theistic faith. So we got into a bunch of stuff like the Big Bang, creation versus evolution, fine tuning, and even a little bit about the Shroud of Turin as well. And okay, he's gone, so I guess I'll fill in.
No, that's
I
awesome.
bored him to death.
No, I'm back. I'm back. I hit the wrong
Okay.
button there. So yeah, so you put out two shows. That's awesome. And let's kick it over to Ben as well. Ben, so what have you been doing with Real Theology recently?
So we just released an episode that was an interview with Professor Paul Russell on David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And so Paul Russell is a Hume scholar, and so he's written a book called The Riddle of Hume's Treatise. And so he tries to kind of untangle the um, tensions that are within David Hume's treatise of human nature. He's got two themes. He's got a naturalism theme and a skepticism theme, and it's often seen that these two themes are in tension. And so Paul Russell is very famous in Hume scholar circles because of this book, of really the kind of way that he's systematically tried to make sense of those skeptical themes, not only throughout the treatise, but also extending into Hume's an inquiry concerning human understanding, and then obviously in the dialogues concerning natural religion. And so we just have a lot of fun talking about the dialogues. I've been thinking and writing seriously about the dialogues for about 10 years now. And so this episode was kind of a culmination of just all of that work that I've invested into thinking about David Hume's dialogues and why it's so important to understanding contemporary philosophy of religion today. Because we really are where we are at today because of the way that book has influenced the field.
Right on. So, guys, this is not a typical Christian on Christian show. I'm doing a part of a series from my thesis where I've been interviewing certain people and trying to get others' viewpoints on the problem of evil. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight, which I thought we'd bring an atheist on. Ben is well known in this field, and I wanted his professional opinion on this. And let him present the challenge to theism that the problem of evil will pose to Christians, specifically, even, or theists in general. But Ben, before we get into that, tell us a little bit about your channel and what you do there.
So my channel is called Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast, and my co-host Justin Schieber and I explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives. So we really see ourselves as continuing in a tradition that really kind of came about with David Hume of having a more skeptical attitude towards religious traditions and religious philosophies more generally. And so we like to explore contemporary questions in the philosophy of religion and see how things like secular, naturalistic forms of faith or religion could be alternatives once we've rejected something like perfect being theism. And so really we felt like there was a hole in the online atheist community in the sense that there wasn't any really serious scholarship being dedicated to understanding what it is naturalism and humanism can bring to the table, and how we can help not only people find the tools they need in their own journeys, but to help make progress and for the discussion for future inquiries in religious questions.
Right on, right on. And, I appreciate a lot of your work as well. It does definitely bring a challenge to our theistic minds and us apologists that are out there trying to promote the faith, to actually get another opinion, and a well-reasoned one that actually puts the challenge up in front of us, and we're able to dialogue about it. That's what Faith Unaltered is about, is to dialogue about these type of things and to engage with not only the atheism, but the culture in general. We want to engage with like a lot of different people, and we also want to equip fellow believers to be able to defend their faith better, instead of looking at a meme maybe and going off that and thinking it's fact. But Ben, it's like I said, it's a pleasure. This guy's is a part of a series. Again, we've already had Dr. Phil Carey on to talk about the history of the problem of evil from a Christian point of view, and how Christians have thought about the problem of evil throughout the years and stuff like that. And he took a more Augustinian approach, and you're able to hear that a couple weeks ago. Today, we're going to get into the atheist and what he thinks about it. What I'm going to try to do here is, in a few weeks, or maybe within the next month, is do a response to Ben's slides here and his presentation, and then bring him back on after I do that and have a discussion together and see how that turns out. So Ben, I already told him about it, and he's agreed to it. And Dale, he wants to be a part of it as well. So it's going to be a fun time. So guys, I'm going to give Ben the floor and let him give us his slides up and, go to town here.
Whoop. Okay. So everyone can see the slides, right? Everything's good?
Yep.
So the term or phrase problem of evil is in one sense misleading. So it might sound like there's just one problem of evil, but really the problem of evil is a family of problems. Really, it's a family of interrelated problems. And so a problem of evil can more aptly be described as a theme of certain problems that arise when we think about the characterizations that we give to a divine being such as God, and what we observe in the world. So an important question raised by our experiences of suffering and other evils is whether or not the world contains undesirable states of affair that count against our believing there exists a perfect being such as God. But now, so this raises questions. What do we mean by God? So I have here defined that God is a perfect being, but what do we mean by a perfect being? So these are the types of questions that really kind of define the biggest fault lines in the philosophy of religion, because there is no real universal consensus about how we should cash these terms out. But don't fear, we can distinguish between certain models of God. And so I'll get to that here in a second. But when it comes to arguments from evil, I think it's really important at the start to realize that there's three essential features to an argument from evil. So anytime that you want to examine someone's argument from evil, let's say you're an atheist giving an argument from evil, or let's say you're a theist who is evaluating someone's argument from evil, there's three pieces that you're going to want to look for. Now, they might be explicitly there, they might be implicitly there, like how I said that God was a perfect being. There can be a lot of content there, but it might need more unpacking. So the three characteristics of an argument from evil are a characterizing claim, where we make some supposition about God and God's nature. So if we are to accept the conclusions of cosmological arguments or teleological arguments, we are considering a non-physical intelligence that not only caused the universe to exist, but is also responsible for the order that we observe in the universe. Order, harmony, however you want to cash out the teleological argument. And so we have to supplant this model of God with additional claims about the content of God's character. Things like what God would desire, what God would believe, how God would achieve his ends. A second feature of an argument from evil is an observation or judgment that I'll call a datum. So the datum is just an observation of evil. It's a judgment like there is suffering in the world. There is a lot of suffering in the world. The suffering seems randomly distributed in the world. These are all datums in the sense that they're observations that we can all readily conceive. And the third piece of an argument from evil is the link. You have to somehow have some form of reasoning that links this datum with the characterizing claims that you've made about God. So I said earlier that we needed to be more precise if we're going to use terms like perfect being. So we can look to different models of God. So one model of God is monotheism, but this is a very thin concept of God. This conceives of God as a single disembodied mind that causally interacts with the physical world. But this model is too thin for an argument from evil to get any traction because we haven't made any characterizing claims about what God's nature is like. So the most common model of God that you will find in specifically Western philosophy of religion circles is what's known as perfect being theism. So in this model of God, God is a perfect and personal being who is always worthy of our worship. And he has essential divine features of infinite power, perfect knowledge, moral perfection, and unsurpassable love. So let's go through some of these divine attributes real quickly, just to say a little something about them so that people have at least the right concepts that are going to be in play in the rest of the presentation. So God's omnipotence is a way of describing God's infinite power. So God has the ability to perform any logically possible act of which the description is coherent. God is only constrained by logical limitations. So the only limitations that God has, there's a famous paradox of, can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift? Well, no, because such a object is literally contradictory. And so God is only constrained by things like the laws of logic. So God can't bring about what is logically incoherent, but everything else is game. God has perfect knowledge, or what is often called God's omniscience. So God could only have true beliefs about the world and about what matters. God would know all the true propositions that it was logically consistent to know. So there's often a paradox of, could God know future events of free creatures? One response is that no, God couldn't have that knowledge, so-called open theists, the idea that it's logically impossible for God to know future free acts. But this is no limitation to God's knowledge any more than the laws of logic were a limit to God's power. The third divine property I want to consider is arguably the most important, specifically for conversations about the problem of evil, because it's where we're attributing uniquely moral or ethical properties to God. We're saying God's nature would be so constituted that he always performs morally permissible acts and never performs any wrong acts. God's goodness would not be deficient in any way. This is what I mean when I say God's nature would be perfect. It would be complete. It would be whole without any deficiency. There's nothing that we could add to God to make him greater. The final divine property I want to consider is unsurpassable love. So according to divine love, God's love for finite creatures would be infinite and inexhaustible. Such love would involve universal benevolence towards and universal caring for the well-being of finite creatures, including non-human animals. So this is the idea that God has not only the power and knowledge of all of his finite creatures, but he also has the motivation to seek out a meaningful, positive, reciprocating relation with those finite creatures. So that kind of does it for the characterizing claims. As far as what happens in the rest of this discussion, I'm going to take for granted the perfect being model of God, because that's really the target of arguments from evil. Like I said, the characterizing claim is essential, and that these should be claims that theists are readily willing to concede. And so that really leaves a lot of the play in arguments to evil to be between the datum and the link. And so there's 5 important distinctions when formulating an argument from evil. So the first will be logical versus evidential. So logical arguments from evil versus evidential arguments from evil. Abstract versus concrete. So abstract formulations that don't appeal to any real particular details, where concrete observations of evil consider specific instances of evil. Realist versus anti-realist. So this is your traditional meta-ethical distinctions. So we could be subjectivists about moral properties, or we could be objectivists about moral properties. The fourth distinction is axiological versus deontological. So we have to choose what terms, if we're going to use ethical terms to cash out our argument from evil, we need to know if those terms or if those concepts involve goodness and badness or rightness and wrongness. Which one do we give more priority to? Is the priority given to wrongness, where there's certain states of affairs that it would be wrong for God to allow, or is value given the priority? And so what matters is how things go. Did God create the best of all possible worlds? The final distinction is metaphysical versus epistemic. So an epistemic argument from evil involves our knowledge of actual evils. But metaphysical arguments from evil consider a range of possible evils. And so I'll explain that one in more detail later, because I think that one's probably the trickiest of the distinctions to really see in the abstract. So, excuse me. As far as the first distinction goes between logical and evidential arguments from evil, this one is often the most familiar. This is one that you'll see a lot in the literature. A lot of the philosophy of religion literature will emphasize this distinction between logical and evidential arguments from evil. I disagree with that emphasis, but that's neither here nor there at this point. What I really want people to see is the difference between the two. So when we're making a logical argument from evil, we're saying that the existence of evil or some fact about evil is logically incompatible with theism. So if this evil obtains, then as a matter of logic, it follows that theism is false. Whereas with an evidential argument from evil, we're just saying that evil is an observation that changes the probability that theism is false. In fact, it increases the probability that theism is false. So those are the two really important links for arguments from evil. So a very familiar logical argument from evil comes from Epicurus. So Epicurus's famous formulation is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? And so we can see, if we lay this out in a logical structure, both the link, the characterizing claim, and the datum really clearly. So if you look at premise C on the screen, it has that A and B are the two divine properties that we're isolating in this argument, the first being omnipotence, the other being infinite benevolence, and that these are necessary conditions for it to be worthy of worship. That's his last question, why call him God? So you capture all of that with C, and that's your link between your characterizing claim and your datum, E, there is evil. And so as a matter of logic, it follows God does not exist. Evidential formulations, again, they concede the logical possibility of both God and evil, but insist that they're evidence against God or evil. And so what this means, given a logical argument from evil, the probabilities involved will be 0 and 1. With an evidential argument from evil, by conceding the possibility, what you're doing is that you're bounding the probability of theism being true between 0 and 1. So think of logical arguments from evil as operating at those outer bounds of the probability space, whereas evidential arguments from evil work within that probability space. And so really what we want to understand with a probability judgment is evidence. So this is where my David Hume nerd kind of kicks in. So Hume is going to want to say something like that we want to proportion our belief to the evidence, where evidence is something like probability. And so if we're trying to determine the probability of something like theism, we should ask ourselves, is the world considered in general, and as it appears to us in this life, different from what a man or such a limited being would beforehand expect from a very powerful, wise, and benevolent deity? It must be strange prejudice to assert the contrary. So these evidential formulations start from the idea of what would we expect to observe? Is there a mismatch between what we observe in the world and what we would expect if we had never even seen that observation in the first place? And if there is a mixed match there, then we have these evidential considerations. So Hume formulates it like this. 4 hypotheses can be formed concerning the first causes of the universe: that they are endowed with perfect goodness, that they have perfect malice, that they are opposite and have both goodness and malice, that they have neither goodness nor malice, and mixed phenomenon can never prove the two former unmixed principles, and the uniformity and steadiness of general laws seem to oppose the third. The fourth, therefore, seems to be by far the most probable. That is, the first causes of the universe are neutral with regard to good and bad. So Hume's point here, if you look on the screen, is that this hypothesis of indifference, the idea that the universe or any intelligent being that might be in the world is indifferent to us. That's what we have the most reason to infer on our total evidence, because he's gone through all of the possible, the logical space here. Perfect goodness, perfect malice, goodness and malice, neither malice nor goodness. And so the indifference one, given what we know about evil, comes out being the most probable. So the second distinction that I wanted to mention was abstract versus concrete formulations of the argument from evil. So abstract formulations assume the detailed nature of the evils we observe and experience are unimportant. So if you look at Leibniz, he famously said that our world is the best of all possible worlds. And so this is the type of claim that you would see in an abstract argument from evil. It's saying, look, the world taken as a whole, the detailed features of the world aren't what's important here. It's just the nature of the whole. So we can ask, we said God is unsurpassably great. And so that any being greater than him is impossible because God is the greatest possible being. So Kant puts it like this: that the world created by God is the best of all possible worlds is clear for the following reason. If a better world than the one willed by God were possible, then a will better than the divine will would also have to be possible. For indisputably that will is better, which chooses what is better. But if a better will is possible, then so is a being who could express this better will. And therefore this being would be more perfect and better than God. But this is a contradiction, for God is the greatest possible being. So we can formalize Kant's argument here into an abstract argument from evil. We can say if there is a best of all possible worlds, then the actual world can be improved because it is not a best of all possible worlds. That's one datum, possible datum. Another possible datum is if there is not a best of all possible worlds, then the actual world can be improved because there is some better possible world. So we have to choose one of these two datums. A and B present us with a choice. C is a characterizing claim with a link built into it. It says that the actual world can be improved is incompatible with an unsurpassable God because he cannot rationally prefer the worst of two creative acts. And so then it follows as a matter of logic, in the abstract, God did not create the actual world. Concrete formulations think that the detailed nature of evils do matter. We do have to say something about the particular facts of whatever it is we're observing. So Leibniz famously said this was the best of all possible worlds. Well, how did Voltaire try to refute that in Candide? He appealed to the Lisbon earthquake. And so it was that particular fact that the Lisbon earthquake happened on a Sunday while people are at church and killed a lot of innocent people. These particular facts were important to the datum as far as the logic of the argument. So a concrete formulation of a logical argument from evil would look like this. A perfect God eliminates all undeserved suffering it properly can. Non-human animals experience undeserved suffering by predation and disease. God can properly eliminate any undeserved non-human animal suffering. That's the link. So it would follow there is no perfect God. The third distinction is between realist and anti-realist formulations. So an anti-realist formulation would be something like a subjectivist formulation. So according to a subjectivist formulation, some fact is evil as judged by certain observers, and that fact counts against God's existence. So an argument would look like this: God is infinitely powerful and morally perfect. If God exists, then the world is a hedonistic paradise, but the world is not a hedonistic paradise as judged by some observers. Therefore, God does not exist as judged by some observers. Now, this is a way of, it's often replied to arguments from evil that you have to be an objectivist in order to put forward an argument from evil. And I think that's a big mistake. So we can imagine a supposed subjectivist dialoguing with a theist who is also a moral realist. Now let's imagine that this theist is also a hedonistic act utilitarian. He believes that what is good is what increases the maximum difference between pleasure and pain. So whatever maximizes pleasure minus pain. Well, you don't have to be an objectivist about morality in order to point out that this theist's beliefs are inconsistent, because the world is not a hedonistic paradise, even by the same judgments as the theist put it. The theist will quickly concede that the world is not a hedonistic paradise, but according to their beliefs, the theist beliefs, if they were a hedonistic act utilitarian, an ethical subjectivist could point to the tension between those beliefs. So an argument from evil can always be reformulated as an internal critique about inconsistency. There's another important point here too, is that every argument from evil can be cast entirely in non-moral terms. That's why I mentioned the divine property of love. We can say that God is loving. That's not a moral description. That's a psychological description of God. That's something about the way God behaves. He is loving. And then you can appeal as your datum suffering. And so the link can be how love is opposed to the suffering of someone loved. So the entire argument from evil can be run in entire non-moral terms. And so really you can sidestep the distinction between subjective and objective formulations. But so an objectivist formulation would look like this, where we just use standard normative moral terms that have an objective status. So we could say God is infinitely powerful and morally perfect. That's the characterizing claim. Infinite power and moral perfection are incompatible with unjustified evils. That's the link. And there are some unjustified evils. That's the datum. So therefore, God does not exist. So this is if you were to ask me, what is the standard form of the argument from evil? I would say this is in its most standard form, as far as a deductive argument from evil goes. This is the argument that I have in mind. When I reference the argument from evil, either in my writing or in my talk, this is the formulation that I have in mind. So I've introduced a new term here, though, an unjustified evil. I've been using the term evil throughout this discussion so far, but now I've said an unjustified evil. Now I've gotten to the point where I need to define some terms. We need to get more precise about what it is that we're talking about. What precisely is it that raises the problem for theism? And so if we're going to say evil as an answer to that question, we have to say, what does evil consist of? And so the claim I want to say is something intrinsically undesirable, something that we all have reason to want to avoid. So something like suffering. Suffering is the paradigmatic example of evil. An unjustified evil is a state of affairs a being such as God would not be justified in allowing. But now all I've done is replaced unjustified with something that would not be justified for God to allow. What does it mean for something to not be, that would not be justified for God to allow? So that's where we get the term inscrutable evils. So those are the types of evils that we can discern no God justifying reasons for God to permit or allow. Things like bone cancer in children. When we think about it really, really hard, we can't see any reason why God would allow these things. They don't seem to have any good benefits that outweigh the costs that come with them. So these are inscrutable evils. There's also two important types of evil that we can distinguish between: moral evils and natural evils. So moral evils are the evils that result from the decisions of agents, like finite human persons. So events like the Holocaust, those were not, caused by events in nature that were mindless chance processes. These were intentional acts of persons. Natural evils are evils that don't arise from the intentional decisions of agents. So they are things that do result from things like mindless chance processes, things like earthquakes or hurricanes, diseases, predation in the wild. The Lisbon earthquake that I mentioned earlier, this is an example of a natural evil. That's not because of the decisions of any person, but it's just the result of plate tectonics. So as far as unjustified evils, I said an evil that God would not be justified in allowing. But now we've got to cash out this concept of justified. And we can do that in one of two different ways. We can give priority to value, or we can give priority to rightness and wrongness, what are all called deontological concepts. So the fourth distinction is between axiological and deontological terms. What are we giving to the priority to? So in an axiological argument from evil, we obviously give things like goodness and badness the moral priority. So The question that would arise is, can it be demonstrated, or is it likely, logical evidential distinction, a perfect being could have created some particular evil without losing some greater good or preventing some evil equally bad or worse? So you notice that the words good and bad appear in this. So this means that the basic principle that we're appealing to here has goodness and badness at its moral foundation. So an axiological moral principle would look like the intense suffering of morally innocent creatures is in an intrinsically bad state of affairs. So we can say God is an infinitely powerful and morally perfect characterizing claim. Some states of affairs is evil if an infinitely powerful or morally perfect God could have prevented it without losing some greater good or preventing some evil equally bad or worse. The suffering endured by morally innocent creatures could have been prevented by a perfect being without losing some greater good or preventing some evil equally bad or worse. So this is a formulation of William Rowe's famous example with a small fawn that dies in a forest fire and suffers in agonizing pain for several days before it finally dies. And so Rowe asks us, he goes, what greater good could this isolated fawn, who's obviously a morally innocent creature, what greater good could this possibly contribute to? And he thinks that it's just absurd to think that it could contribute in any meaningful way to some greater organic whole. An omnipotent God could almost certainly have achieved that organic whole without that young fawn's suffering. A deontological argument from evil asks, can it be demonstrated, or is it likely allowing the intense suffering endured by morally innocent creatures is a morally wrong act, all things considered? So it's judging God's action, not the consequences of what is going on in the world or the value of the world as a whole, but the moral, it's making a moral judgment about God's act itself, whether it was right or wrong. So a deontological moral principle would look like intentionally allowing the intense suffering of morally innocent creatures is a wrong-making property of an act. So think of Peter Singer's famous drowning child thought experiment here. You wander into the woods and you find a small child drowning in a shallow pond. And you think to yourself, you look around, you don't see anyone around. What should you do? Should you save this child or should you not? You have a nice new pair of leather shoes on. You don't want to muddy your shoes. Would it be wrong to just walk away from this child and let them drown so that you don't muddy your shoes? Most people would say yes. But then if you say that that's wrong, then it has to be because some moral principle is true. And that moral principle would look like this one. Intentionally allowing that child to drown would be a wrong-making property of that act. And that wrong-making property is not sufficiently counterbalanced by the inconvenience of you muddying your shoes. So a deontological argument from evil would look like this. God is infinitely powerful, morally perfect, characterizing claim. An act is an unjustified evil if it has wrong-making properties not counterbalanced by right-making properties, all things considered. That's our link. Intentionally allowing the suffering actually endured by morally innocent creatures is a wrong-making property which is not counterbalanced by right-making properties. So therefore, it would follow God does not exist. So the last distinction I want to go through is probably the most abstract. So far we've considered formulations of the argument from evil that appeal to our knowledge of actual evils, evils that we observe in the actual world. But arguments from evil are not limited to evils in the actual world. We can also appeal to evils across all metaphysically possible worlds if we make an additional characterizing claim. That additional characterizing claim that God is metaphysically necessary, i.e., that God exists in all possible worlds. And this is often traditionally thought to be a characteristic of the traditional God of monotheism. God's existence could not have been otherwise. Any evil, though incompatible with God, is a metaphysical and moral category, but it's not an epistemic one. So if there are evils incompatible with God in any metaphysical possible world, and God exists necessarily, then it follows God doesn't exist. So this is what that argument would look like. If God exists, then God exists necessarily. If God exists necessarily, then nothing incompatible with God's existence is metaphysically possible. But evil incompatible with the existence of God is metaphysically possible. Therefore, God does not exist. And so it's often thought that in order for an argument from evil to go through, that there have to be assumptions made about evils in the actual world. That's actually not true. If we are also supposing that God exists metaphysically necessarily, then any evil incompatible with God's existence, all it takes is the metaphysical possibility of that evil obtaining, that is, that evil incompatible with God obtains in some possible world, then it follows that God does not exist. So this is kind of like a reverse modal ontological argument combined with the argument from evil. Not all of these distinctions matter equally, though. So I'm of the view that the subjectivist-objectivist distinction is really not that helpful. I mentioned that earlier. But I also don't think that logical and evidential distinctions matter that much either. If some actual evil is unjustifiable in all possible worlds, then God's non-existence is necessary, and a logical argument from evil is sound. If some actual evil is unjustifiable in only some possible worlds, then God's non-existence is contingent, and an evidential argument from evil is sound. Either way, there would be a sound argument from evil and reason to doubt God's existence. Even if we deny the reality of evil, we still have a problem of missing good. And even if we are subjectivists about morality, the problem can be recast in non-moral terms. So it's not clear to me that either of these distinctions helps the theist avoid the problem, nor do I think either distinction helps the atheist make their case. I think these distinctions, in the last analysis, are largely irrelevant. Now, abstract and concrete and axiological and deontological distinctions, I think, matter much more. The detailed natures of evil will matter depending on what theodicy we are considering. That some evils are natural evils rather than moral evils is relevant to the free will and soul building defenses. What consequences and characters are good and bad, and what actions are right and wrong, form some of the deepest questions in moral philosophy. How we frame or respond to the problem of evil will depend on what we think matters most. What matters most might depend on what happens to us, but it might depend on how we respond to things that happen to us. These are all important decisions that are going to have really big effects on, one, how we formulate a problem from evil, or two, how we might respond to it. So responding to an argument from evil is often called theodicy. Theodicies are suppositions meant to resolve the logical or evidential tensions between God's existence on the one hand and the reality of evil on the other. And there are four, at least, historically important theodicies that I want to cover tonight. So the first is the privation theory of evil, the free will theodicy, the soul-building theodicy, and skeptical theism. So according to the privation theory of evil does not actually have a positive existence in the world. It's not actually an ontological feature of the world. It is not a substance nor a property, but rather the absence of a substance or property. It's specifically the absence of the property of good, or a privation of substance, form, and goodness. Everything that exists is good insofar as it exists, because goodness and being are convertible. So God is identical to or convertible with being itself. This is the classical theist model of God. And so that Augustine says this in The City of God, for evil has no positive nature, but the loss of good has received the name evil. So St. Augustine, in my mind, is the greatest Christian thinker to ever live, surpassing even Aquinas. I know some people will be aghast at that, but I really do think that he's one of the best thinkers that the Christian tradition has to offer. And you find
Ben, I'm
privation
sorry.
theory of
I
evil
have to,
right.
Ben. Sorry. I just have to interrupt. I'm sorry. When you said that, I'm the greatest Christian thinker here. So,
Yeah.
not Augustine.
Yeah, right.
No, clarification.
Not from Canada.
Sorry, I interrupted your flow, but go ahead.
No, you're good. You're fine. I had to kiss my son goodnight anyway, so it was perfect timing. So, objections to the privation theory of evil. So, given privation evils, and God creates no evils, there's still a problem of why God allows privation evils. Why is there still this problem of the missing good? Why is it that? And so, really, all we've done is try to verbally resolve the problem of evil. And so a lot of people aren't really satisfied with this as a solution to the problem of evil. And I think that's rightly so, because it actually just kind of defines the problem out of existence. Boethius, another major Christian thinker, I perceive that in nature, the fact that things are good is one thing, and that they are is another. And so this gets echoed by David Hume, many hundreds of years later, as the is-ought problem, the difference between is and ought. To say that something is good, something exists, is not to tell us anything about whether it is good or bad. Why? Because is and ought take up two non-overlapping domains. And another important objection is that if goodness and being are identical, then claiming something is good only states the trivial fact that this thing exists. So if I say that something is good, all I have said is that this exists. So if I say charity is good, the only fact that I could state is charity is charity. But that would be trivial. So in the end, all of our moral claims would just be trivial claims. And we can't use trivial claims to help us make good decisions or act rightly. And the last objection, I think, is really kind of the most decisive, is it's just not a plausible theory of evil in the first place, because it seems like pain, depression, and dread are all positive features of the world, but are also evil. They're not an absence or the privation of some other theory. There's not something I could add to pain, depression, or dread to somehow make them good. If I were to do that, they wouldn't be pain, dread, or depression. The second theodicy I want to consider is the free will theodicy. So this is probably the most popular one I see online, at least, but that's an anecdotal judgment of mine. The idea is that God created a finite world of creatures for the purpose of meaningful relationship, but a necessary condition for such relationship is free will. Free will is such a great good that its value outweighs the bad consequences that result from finite creatures who abused their free will and create evil. God has neither the leeway freedom to eliminate evil, because the greater good of free will entails evil, nor does God have the source freedom to prevent the free actions of finite creatures. Otherwise, those finite creatures would not really be free. So the evil that we observe in the world is not God's responsibility. God couldn't have done anything about it. But this doesn't count against God's omnipotence, because it's said that it's a logical fact that God can't determine creatures' acts and them still be free. Objections to the free will theodicy. The first is that it explicitly assumes causal concerns incompatibilism about causal determinism and free will. So causal determinism might be true. Causal determinism is like the specter of causal determinism on incompatibilist free will is so large because the arguments in favor of causal determinism seem so decisive. So if you are not a compatibilist about free will, causal determinism can be this really big threat to even the plausibility of the free will theodicy in the first place. You might think that there's a compatibilist way out, a similar compatibilist theodicy, but I don't think so, because on a compatibilist view, you could just say it was within God's power. God had the omnipotent power to create a world in which every creature freely chooses good. And that's a coherent proposition. Another objection is that God is morally perfect, yet cannot choose evil. So he doesn't have the significant freedom to actually choose evil. But if he's perfectly good, if it's a good-making, if he has all of the relevant good-making properties, why think the ability to choose evil is a great good if God lacks it? What's so great about free will? Why should we grant this assumption that free will is this great good that's worth allowing things like the Holocaust? Another potentially embarrassing point for Christians is their conception of heaven. So in heaven, it's said that there is no evil. Well, if there's no evil in heaven, are we free in heaven? Well, if we're not free in heaven, why think that free will is such a great good? If you can achieve no evil, and either with free will or without free will, why is free will so good in this life if it's not a problem or necessary in heaven? And the final objection, again, is probably the most widely cited as being decisive, is that free will might explain some moral evils, but it doesn't explain natural evils. So things like bone cancer in children or the events of the Lisbon earthquake, these are just things that we're not going to be able to plausibly attribute to the actions of finite creatures. The third theodicy is the soul-building theodicy. So this, I think, if any theodicy goes any real distance, it's this one. God designed the world to be a moral arena where people's significantly free choices, their consequences, and firsthand experiences of natural evils are necessary to develop moral and spiritual growth for a relationship with God. Our world is the best of all possible worlds, and what matters is how we respond to events in this lifetime rather than what happens to us in this lifetime. If we view evil as a problem because it seems unjustified, then that is because we mistakenly think the world should be more like a hedonistic paradise in this life. Objections to the soul-building theodicy. A lot of people, myself included, look at the world and just say, it's really not that conducive to soul building. A lot of people suffer unnecessarily. A lot of children suffer and don't have the opportunity to use it for soul building. Another objection is that people suffer horrendously. People suffer in positively soul-destroying ways, such that they come to believe that their life is, on the whole, not worth living. Non-human animals. So it doesn't seem to me that non-human animals, their struggle for survival in the state of nature, it's not clear to me at all that that's there to develop the souls of animals. Even though I'm not necessarily opposed to the idea of an animal afterlife, perhaps the animals do have soul building that builds them up to this afterlife. But even if we were to grant something like that, the final objection is that compensation for suffering does not entail justification for allowing it. So it might be true that all of this suffering was necessary to achieve some sort of state in the afterlife, but just because we're compensated for all of that suffering in this life, in the afterlife with some great good, that doesn't justify allowing the suffering in the first place. So to use an example from Paul Draper, imagine that I come and I throw a rock and bust out the window of your car. And you might very rightly be indignant of this act, like, hey, why did you break my window? But then I say, well, hold on. I'm going to pay you $30,000 to replace your window. Now, you might be ecstatic. You might go, wow, the window in my car is not worth anywhere near $30,000. This is incredible. He's compensated me well above and beyond the damage that he's done to my property. But does my paying you $30,000 for breaking your window, does that justify me breaking your window in the first place? And I want to say this, no, it doesn't justify that act in the first place. The compensation for it might be some way to help make amends for it, but that doesn't mean that it's justified. And what's relevant to the argument for evil is unjustified evils. So it's not clear that this compensation in the afterlife goes the distance we need it to say that some evil is not an unjustified evil. The last theodicy I want to consider is actually not really a theodicy at all. It's more of a negative claim. It's the idea that we shouldn't even need to give theodicies in the first place because we shouldn't expect to know what God would or would not do. So remember I said in the characterizing claims that we have to make certain claims about God's psychology. Well, skeptical theism is going to be very, very skeptical about all of those claims in a characterizing claim. So given the epistemic distance between us and a perfect being like God, we should be skeptical of the inference from inscrutable evils to unjustified evils, because God justifying reasons for allowing them would likely be obscure or beyond our ken. Some inscrutable evil may be necessary for a greater good or to prevent some evil equally bad or worse. We should remain skeptical of claims that human beings can discern God justifying reasons for the evils we observe. So objections to skeptical theism. So the first is that skeptical theism in the claim that God is incompatible with unjustified evils implies agnosticism. So why do I say that? So the idea here is that in that argument from evil, the theist was committed to unjustified evils being incompatible with God. So if they're committed to the existence of God, the reasonableness of the existence of God, they're also committed to the reasonableness of the there being no unjustified evils in the world. And so if they don't think that we can make a judgment at all about the unjustified evils in the world, that's the thesis of skeptical theism, then it follows we also have to be skeptical of God's existence. And so theism is a double-edged sword here, that it proves too much and leaves us in a state of agnosticism. The second objection is that the probability we would understand God justifying reasons for allowing evil is actually high. So the objection is often pressed in the form of a parent-child analogy. So a child may not understand why they have to go get a vaccine to help prevent them from catching some disease. And they might not be able to understand the subtleties of virology or why it is that they have to endure this pain. But a loving parent would be there for their child and would do everything that they could to help them understand that what they're going through is necessary. And so this shades naturally into the problem of divine silence. And so the third objection is that skeptical theism implies a sort of moral skepticism that we should reject. So to come back to Peter Singer's drowning child thought experiment here, skeptical theism seems to say, look, if we were to stumble across this child drowning in a shallow pond, and we had the power to save them at little to no cost to ourselves, we should wonder maybe this child drowning is logically necessary for some greater good or preventing some evil equally bad or worse, that this is part of God's divine providence. And so that we should take a skeptical route and say, like, no, it doesn't seem to me that this is an unjustified evil. God must be doing this for some reason. And so that I'm in a state of kind of moral paralysis. And so that seems like, again, the skepticism has shaved off more than would be comfortable. And this shades into the last objection, the problem of divine lies. So this idea that God might be justified in lying to us. And so there are certain propositions that we would only have word of God justification to know. So the idea that God will defeat evil in the end, or that Jesus is his son, and he sent that his son to die for us. These are all propositions for which we would have word of God justification only. But if God was morally justified in deceiving us, we could never rule out the possibility that all of these divine promises that have been made to us are really just divine lies. So again, it seems like the skeptical stance that the skeptical theist adopts has unwelcome implications that should lead us to reject that view. So that's what I had as far as a presentation of the argument from evil, and the things that I would want most people to take away from are the structure of it. So the characterizing claim, the link, and the datum, and how those three interplay to make the core of the argument. The 5 distinctions that we went through, I won't run through them all again. And then the 4 theodicies. Skeptical theism is not really a theodicy, but I consider it a theodicy because it comes up in talk of theodicies. But the privation theory of evil, the free will theodicy, soul building theodicy, and skeptical theism. If you were to be able to understand all of this wide range of stuff, you would really have a very good grasp and picture of the family of problems that is the problem of evil.
Right on. Thank you, Ben. That was great. You'll have to send me the updated version of the slides too, because I don't have all those.
Gotcha.
I would like to put them into the comments for people to look at as well. Also to help use them myself when we talk about this later on. But I want to tell the audience, I'm going to give you guys a treat, and I'm going to let the first question of the night be our super chat. So I'll let Ben answer that one real quick. It says, question for Ben. Do you think it's possible for God to create a world with creatures that have free will that wouldn't lead to suffering?
Yeah, so I do think that, but that's because of my views of free will too. So I'm what's called a compatibilist. So I think that freedom of the will is compatible with causal determinism. So the sense of free will that matters to things like our agency and our cognition and our moral responsibility, I think are compatible with causal determinism. But an implication of that is that God could have created finite creatures in such a way that they always freely chose to do good, and so that they never freely chose to do evil. And so that could be a world like heaven. So people ask, like, what would a world with free will look like with no evil? I think it would look like heaven.
All right. So thank you for that, Ben. Real quick, I'm going to hand it over to Dale. He's been kind of quiet there for a while as well. Dale, you got any questions and clarifications that you want to ask Ben?
So many. Yeah, I've got a full page of notes here. So yeah, but I'll limit it to, I guess, 3. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to ask about, so just in terms of the categorization, I noticed you kind of went over various theodicies. Now, one thing that might be helpful is what's the difference between a theodicy and a defense? Because I'll raise the Molinistic defeater as an undercutting defeater or defense where I don't have a burden of proof. What's the difference between a theodicy and a defense against the problem of evil?
Yeah. So in order to make that distinction, we have to go to our distinction between logical and evidential problems of evil. So in the logical problem of evil, we were trying to derive a contradiction between certain claims that theists are making. Whereas in the evidential argument from evil, we are saying that these observations change the probability of theism being true. Well, so in a defense, the aim is only to undercut that logical argument, to say that, look, there's no logical tension between evil and God. And so that's what a defense does. A defense doesn't, it just says, look, for all we know, this possibility is coherent. And that coherence is enough to defeat this logical problem of evil. Now, I have my own qualms about that move, but that's essentially what you're trying to do, because in a theodicy, you're going to try to offer some sort of explanation that makes theism likely, given the fact that we know the evil is there. So these are auxiliary assumptions that we're not saying for all we know are true, but are saying are likely true. likely true to the fact that it's raised that we can still be confident that the probability of theism is high, even though we already know this fact about evil. So theodicy is trying to do a whole lot more work to raise the probability of theism being true, whereas defense is just trying to diffuse a problem.
Gotcha. Yeah, and the way I kind of understand it, would that make sense to say, like, what the theodicies carry with it a burden of proof on the defender, on the theist side, kind of thing, whereas a defense, you could just raise it as kind of
I would say more of a burden of proof. So the burden of proof for the defense is lighter because your standard is logical consistency, whereas the burden of justification for a theodicy is going to be much greater. You're not going to be able to get away with just internal consistency or logical conceivability or logical possibility. You're going to have to say more. You're going to have to say something that's probably true.
Gotcha. Perfect. Okay. So my second question is, I just wanted to kind of get your take on a possible combination. So you mentioned there are axiological based problems of evil versus deontological. My own understanding, so I take both, right? So I think in terms of the grounding of morality, it's deontologically speaking, moral principles or rules are violated. What are they? They're God's, oh, bless you. They're God's values, right? So in some way, you can violate God's values. If you do something that's immoral, that's something that God disvalues. And that it's a wrong-making act because it hurts God. You're doing something he doesn't value type thing. And then on the teleological end, you can ask, well, why does he value this or disvalue that? And that's where we can say, well, because it leads to flourishing and, or whatever. So it leads to some kind of end that is valuable or something like that. Do you think there's like a way to kind of make a problem of evil that would address a combination like axiological and deontological aspects?
So no. So it's not an either. It's not an or that like we have to choose between value or right and wrong. The idea behind this distinction is that we have to give priority to one of them. Is the right in the good, or is the good in the right? So we have to, again, the datum requires us to make some sort of judgment about the world. Well, is that judgment in deontological terms? Is the final ethical property that we're appealing to rightness and wrongness, or is the final ethical property that we're appealing to goodness or badness? So if I think that it's goodness and badness, I might say the world is the best possible world. But if I think that if it's rightness or wrongness, I might say that God has an unsurpassably moral character. Perfect creator implies a perfect creation because he's did everything right, and that's what's most important. So you can use deontological and axiological concepts. We all do in moral discourse. It's not that one replaces the other, but we have to give some sort of moral priority to them because, again, we have this link between the characterizing claim and the datum, and that link is going to involve some sort of moral judgment. Is that moral judgment made about the value of something, or is it made about the rightness and wrongness of an act? Does that make sense?
Yep. I hear what you're saying. So, all right, cool. So my last question before I hand it back to Mr. Russell there is, so one of the things you mentioned about, I think it was about with respect to the soul building theodicy, and you mentioned compensation does not justify an immoral.
It doesn't entail justification. There's still a question of whether, if I've compensated something, does that justify my act? There's still a further question. That's the point.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that's where you gave the example of someone saying like, hey, I'll smash your window and I'll pay you $30,000. And you're like, yeah, go ahead, type deal. Right. I was just wondering.
So you just come along and you smash their window. You don't tell them about it. Like you do it as an act of vandalism.
Okay.
And then when they find out, they're like, dude, why did you break my window? Like, what the hell, man?
Okay.
And then you're like, okay, look, I understand you're upset. Well, here, how about I give you $30,000? Well, that doesn't just, it's not clear to me. It certainly doesn't, it's not entailed by that compensation that my act of vandalism in the first place was justified. So the parallel here is God creates us, allows us some wrong act, but then is compensating for us that wrong act in the afterlife. Does the compensation in the afterlife entail that God was justified in allowing, we'll say, like the Holocaust? Like, if you say, okay, well, look, all the victims of the Holocaust will be compensated for all of that suffering that they experienced during the Holocaust. Well, does God's compensating for the Holocaust victims in the afterlife justify his allowing of the Holocaust? If that would still be wrong, then the fact that he compensates everyone in the afterlife doesn't entail that that's not an unjustified evil. And it's unjustified evils that are relevant to the problem of evil, because those are what we are saying are incompatible with God's properties.
Okay, so here's the qualification or the added nuance I wanted to ask you about, because that's not entirely analogous to what God's doing, or at least certain forms of theism, such as Christian theism, which has a doctrine of fault. So it's not like
this is just an objection to soul building. So this, you're right. Like, there's a lot of wiggle room in this. Yeah. Like, you're not necessarily wedded to some of these assumptions, but this is just the general illustration of the objection that compensation doesn't entail justification. And so
let me ask.
The point is like, even if we concede compensation, there might still be more work to do. That's in the most general form, that's the objection.
Okay. So yeah, I guess just in a nutshell, what I was going to ask is there a difference in that in certain cases, like, God just coming up and doing something evil and then compensating you afterwards, versus in the fall, it's not really, he didn't create evil. He created that world good. Then we actively chose to force God into the situation where he had to use evil to achieve the greater good. But he didn't set up the system. Like, he didn't start off by smashing the window. We did something first that forced him to have to smash the window and then compensate us. Could that make a difference?
And that's a fair difference, and so let me try to cash the analogy out in a different way that kind of avoids the issue that you're raising. So imagine that a parent walks out on their children and so spends most of this child's life not being a part of that child's life. Now, this child might grow from this experience of being raised without this parent. It might make them a really good person because of all the adversity that they had because of this. Now, let's imagine that parent comes back in their life and says, look, I realize I wasn't there for you in the long run, but I thought that's what would be best for you. And in fact, it was best for you. But now that you're the type of person that you need to be, I want to have a meaningful relationship with you. In fact, I'm going to give you all of my fortune that I've made right now. And we're going to go live. You're not going to have to work for the rest of your life. We're just going to go live basically, the high life on this fortune. Again, you're compensating, this parent might be compensating their child for the hardship for an action that they performed by walking out on them all that time ago. Does all that compensation, does all that soul building that resulted because of that action, does that justify the parent walking out on the child when they were a child? And so I think a lot of people would want to say no, or possibly no. Really what the point is illustrating is that we know that compensation, even if we give all the compensation we want, that's not going to entail justification. Just because you've compensated for a past act that you've performed, that doesn't justify you performing that act in the first place. Because some acts might just be wrong. It might just be wrong to walk out on your kids. It might just be wrong for God to allow something like the Holocaust. Even if we concede all of the points about compensation.
Gotcha. Thank you so much. All right, awesome. Over to you, David Russell.
Right on. Ben, very great presentation again. I'm glad. I love how you, you bring out the definitions. Like you're not saying, like you say, it's a, evil could be undesirable states of affairs, right? But evil's not suffering in and of itself, right? And I think you did that well with it's the same that G.E. Moore does with it as well, right? When he goes over moralism and stuff, right? Good's not this or that. Otherwise, it's you're equating the terms, and why have the term in and of itself? One thing that I think you did do that too, though, is on the privation view, right? Because I think we're starting with Augustine, and where Aquinas did kind of clear it up, I think later on was where he was like, okay, you can't equate being with good, right? You can't do that. However, being is a good, being alive is a good thing. So I think that clarification was needed on that, but it, we're, it's kind of hard to start off, because it seems like what we do with these philosophically, do you think philosophically that I guess theologies aren't really considered in these formulations, or partially considered, I guess would be the right question. Do you think theologies are partially considered, or the entirety of the theology is considered when they're putting the philosophical arguments out there for the problem of evil?
So I think the philosophy of religion is going to be logically prior to the theology, only in the sense that the philosophy of religion is engaging with claims that are made in theology. So an argument from evil just wouldn't have any traction if the claims that it uses in the characterizing claims weren't taken right from theology. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If those were just, these claims didn't have a place anywhere in the world, there would be no relevance for the argument for evil. Yeah. So in a certain sense, there's certain theological features that are inseparable from it, because it's a critique of certain models of theology. Now, I think it's also important to realize that there are a lot of features of theology that are unimportant to certain questions in the argument from evil. So one of the distinctions is that there's an intellectual problem of evil and that there's an existential problem of evil. So the intellectual problem of evil is what I've just been discussing tonight. But the existential problem of evil is coming to live. So if we're theists or atheists, it's how do we go about living a life in a reality of suffering? And so that one, there's theology might be relevant to that existential problem in ways that it's not relevant to the argument from evil. And there's ways in which the argument from evil just isn't relevant to the existential problem from evil. So like if a parent's child was dying of cancer, you wouldn't go try to run the problem of evil with that person. Like, that's just completely ridiculous. But then again, if you're tackling the intellectual problem of evil, falling back into the theology is not like, unless the theology actually solves the problem. Or if you say, well, I need this part of the theology so that I can do this existential problem of suffering. Okay, well, but does that solve the intellectual problem of evil? And so it's very easy to get certain theological considerations tangled up, in a sense that certain considerations might be relevant to certain questions, but not others. And parsing out which those are is not only a difficult question in the philosophy of religion, it's a difficult question of theology. And so this is it's one of those topics where two really, really big abstract domains intersect.
Right. Absolutely.
And the logical space is rich in history, is rich in diversity, is rich in having its genius writers. Protestants and Catholics have had both their shares of great thinkers who really blurred the lines between philosophy and theology. I'm thinking a lot of Kant, a lot here. These were figures that Aquinas and Kant really are kind of the two that stand out in my mind of being these system builders that really blurred the lines between what was their theology and what was their philosophy.
Right on. So my second question is more or less to the idea of the perfect being thesis, and do we kind of assume too much in that when we say something like, okay, God is infinitely, he's got infinite power, and then we kind of just go off on that, and we assume what that would entail for that God to do, right? And then perfect knowledge, then we go off that tangent, and then we put, I don't want to say tangent, but that idea, so to speak, and bless you. And we go off of that, and we assume what that would entail. But in fact, don't you think that some of these could buttress each other in some way, to where, like, okay, so if God's infinitely powerful, you know, he could do whatever he wants, basically, but perfect knowledge would prevent him from doing everything we want. And do we need to consider that maybe there's something there that we're not considering, and that's why we live in the world we live in?
So I think it's really important for there to always be two divine properties under consideration in the argument from evil. So I listed four today: omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and perfect love. I think that omniscience actually follows from omnipotence. So if something has all power, it has the power to know everything.
Right.
And if something is morally perfect and love is a moral virtue, well, then it has love to its ultimate degree. So really, the love is subordinate to the moral perfection, and perfect knowledge is subordinate to perfect power. So I think these are the two indispensable divine properties if you're going to run an argument from evil, because you have to say that it was within God's ability to prevent unjustified evils. So there's some datum that God could have done something about. It was within God's leeway, freedom to do something about. Have to say something about his power. And because God is personal, and what separates him from an indifferent universe is that he has to be motivated to do something about the datum. Your link has to connect God's motivation with that datum. And so the only way to do that is to make suppositions about God's moral perfection. We have to say, and so the thought here is that God has power and goodness to an infinite degree. Why an infinite degree? Well, because if it was finite, we'd have to explain why he has this amount of power and goodness rather than some other amount of power or goodness. So for the simplest views would be that God has no power and goodness, or has infinite power and goodness. So it's taking advantage of the simplicity of infinity by giving these attributes of power and motivation an infinite magnitude. But it's that move. It's that move of infinite, unsurpassable magnitude. That's really what gives the argument from evil bite, because that's the piece in the characterizing claim that says, look, it's within God's power and it's within God's motivation to do something about what we observe. You're linking the characterizing claim to the datum. That's the argument. Those are the pieces. And so if you don't have the two characterizing features of the characterizing claim, if you don't have omnipotence and omnibenevolence, moral perfection, then you don't have any more. You could say, like, well, it wasn't within God's power to do something about this. Or you'd say, God's not morally perfect. And so, like, if you can't say either of those things, you lose.
Yeah, of course. And I think that's where it does kind of lose bite for me, is because I think there's a lot of underlying circumstances that would prevent him from, being doing something in a certain situation because he knows that certain situation will produce a better outcome, or the outcome that would be able, or I guess a telos, an ending point
So
that
you
would be
said
desired.
underlying features. Is that what you said? There's underlying features.
I want to say features, but like underlying knowledge that he would have of, like, that would bring that would make his I guess attributes be known more, or I mean,
So I
I would
think
try to use
features
an
is a
example
perfectly
of it,
fine.
right?
Yeah, I think
Okay, good.
features is a fine term. Yeah, I'm coming back to Dale's question earlier about the
Yeah,
difference between a theodicy and a defense.
right,
So the defense is going to say, look, this feature, this underlying feature, is just possible,
right,
and then that would diffuse a problem. Whereas
yeah.
the theodicy is going to say, look, there is this underlying feature.
And
This
that's what I was
underlying
getting at. Yeah,
Yeah, so the theodicy
absolutely.
is going to try to make that underlying feature more probable, and that
Right.
it,
And
and so
it would
that's
be
I
like,
don't.
so yeah,
Go
and
ahead.
that's what I'm talking about. Like when I'm questioning you on this, is because in my theodicy, the theodicy I'm working towards is like all these things. There is these underlying features theologically of why these things happen. And then there's obviously different categories that you probably wouldn't agree with me, and a lot of philosophers don't agree with. I don't think there's a such thing as natural evil. I don't think there's a tsunamis are a bad thing. I think people dying are a bad thing, because I don't think that was what the purpose of humans were supposed to be. Animals, I think, are in a different category, and they're supposed to die. They're supposed to replenish the earth that way and provide for the resources of the earth and stuff like that. And that's where I would say, like, things like unsurpassable love kind of come into, okay, well, there's still a hierarchy when it comes to this love, because the theology will tell us we're the apple of God's eye, right? Where the animals were meant for us to eat. I'm gonna throw out the young earthers here because I think we all think that's ridiculous, right? But I'm not gonna discount it. Of course, Dale was like telling me, yeah, you're still gonna have to answer them, and I even talked to him about it. But the fact that, like, the resurrected Jesus cooked fish, right, and ate fish with his disciples and provided fish to the masses and the feeding of the 5,000. All those are, like, things I'm contemplating and searching through to be able to say, hey, look, there is a hierarchy of these things, but I do want to give it to Dale. I'll end up rambling, and me and you will end up engaging on stuff. But Dale, go ahead. I know you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, no, it was just a very quick thing on the characterizing claims, because I think I agreed 100%, 99% with Ben's characterizations of God's
Yeah.
qualities. The
Yeah,
only
so do
thing,
I.
the only thing I had one question on was about the loving aspect, and I forget how you worded it. My notes just say you mentioned something about God relates to animals and to humans, and my question was kind of like, well, what if animals are there for the sake of humans to bring it, and they, by engaging with humans, that allows them to relate to God. So it's not God has to love or relate to animals. They're just an instrument for getting humans to the point to relate to God. Something like that. Again, I can't remember how you worded it on your slide there, but yeah. Does that
Yeah,
make sense?
yeah. So what I said is that God's perfect love would imply a universal benevolence towards and universal caring for all finite creatures. So I am think that one of the datums that we can appeal to is the fact that non-human animals suffer, and that non-human animal suffering is morally relevant, and so that God allowing that much pain and suffering to the world through the process of biological evolution has a moral worth to it, and that it's a largely negative moral worth. There is good in it, don't get me wrong. Like, there's the conscious experiences of goodness, or of pleasure and of happiness, that non-human animals experience is certainly good. There's also a massive amount of non-human animal pain. And so this is just the problem of animal pain. One way to avoid this is to kind of take the Descartes route and just seeing that, animals are sort of like automata in that they are tools for us. They're things, they are objects in the world that we can use to achieve our ends, and that they don't have any moral significance to our lives. And so I'm not inclined to go down that route. I think that
Me
animals.
neither, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is a move. Like, it's a legitimate move in
Exactly.
the philosophy of religion, is to
Of
just
course.
deny a moral status to animals. I don't go that route. I don't find that possible, but I obviously some people do. It's been a historically
Yeah.
important thought. I mean, Descartes.
Yeah, Ben, I would actually go.
Hard to think of a more important figure who held the
Yeah.
view.
Exactly.
Ben, like I would go to more of like a middle of the road view, right, where there is a sense of caring, but not as heavily like a hierarchical system.
Yeah, I think that's right. So there's a very
So
famous distinction in the literature
yeah,
between a moral agent and a moral patient. And
right,
so
yeah,
a moral agent is a being that has moral responsibilities, that can respond to reasons in the world and act for those reasons. Whereas a moral patient, it doesn't have moral obligations. They can't appreciate moral reasons, but they can be the benefactor of a moral obligation. So, like, babies are very clearly moral patients, but they're not moral agents. We don't hold children, very small children, morally responsible for their actions, because they're just not moral agents.
until they
And
start
so
until they start biting.
yeah.
No.
So we see that agency is something that grows and emerges out of certain amounts of complexity and orders of rationality that we just don't see in non-human animals. So we just, why is it not wrong when a lion kills a gazelle? Well, because a lion's not a moral agent. It can't appreciate moral reasons not to, one, hunt gazelles and harm them, but two, find the resources and nutrients needed to act otherwise. So a famous is ought implies can. It can only be the case that I ought to do something if I can do it. Well, if a lion could find a alternative means of food and could direct their lives in ways that didn't harm gazelles, but could keep their, meet all the needs they did, well, then they should. And now they would cease to be moral patients, and they would become moral agents.
Yeah. Unless there's an underlying thing that this is what they were designed to do, because it actually keeps the gazelle population from destroying the grass, and we get more luscious green pastures we can gaze upon. But no, I mean, I see what you're saying. Dale, did you have anything else? I do want to get to some of the questions in the audience, because they've been waiting patiently.
We've got about
we're starting. Yeah.
Yeah, we can go to the audience question. I want to make sure we fit in everyone. So.
Yeah, I know we got a few questions. I don't know if we'll get everyone, but we got the super chat in. So yeah. Ben, the first question. But yeah, Ben, it was a great presentation. Like, I agreed with like a lot of it. And I just wanted the clarifications on, what you clarified on, and the fact that there are, obviously there's more things to consider basically when we make these arguments. So I think that's
none
really
of us have had the last word in the problem of evil. The problem of evil will survive all of us.
All right, here's the first question. I'm confused about the metaphysical argument. How can a possible evil conceived result in an actual conclusion that God doesn't exist?
That's a great question. So this, like I said, this is probably the most abstract way of thinking about the problem of evil, and so it can be a little counterintuitive at first. So the claim is that God exists necessarily. So this is something that we have to add to the characterizing claim. Remember how I said that power and goodness were the two really essential claims that we need? Well, for this metaphysical distinction, we're going to have to add a third, divine property at least, and that's necessary existence. And so, to use the jargon from philosophy, the modal jargon is God exists in all possible worlds. That's what we mean when we say God is metaphysically necessary. So all possible worlds are the range of ways the world could have been. And so, of those ways that the world could have been, God exists in each and every single one of them. Well, if we've also attributed infinite power and infinite goodness to God across all of these possible worlds, and so God is incompatible with unjustified evils. God is incompatible with unjustified evils in all possible worlds. So that means that there's no unjustified evil in any possible world. There's no world in which God exists and an unjustified evil exists. So the metaphysical argument from evil says, look, all I need is the conceptual possibility, or the actual, possibility, metaphysical possibility. All I need is the metaphysical possibility that an evil incompatible with God exists. That's it. Because if that exists in any possible world, if it's metaphysically possible in any of those possible worlds for this evil incompatible with God to obtain, then it follows that God doesn't exist necessarily in all possible worlds. If God doesn't exist necessarily in all possible worlds, he doesn't exist in any of the possible worlds. So this is the double-edged sword that comes with giving necessary existence to God. If he doesn't exist in one possible world, he exists in none of them. If he exists in one possible world, he exists in all of them. So necessary existence makes God's existence an all or nothing thing. It's a binary type thing. And so once you have that binary in place, all you need is the metaphysical possibility of an unjustified evil incompatible with God for it to follow that God doesn't exist.
I just want to add, thank you so much, Ben. Now, for all the skeptics who go after me for using an ontological argument, look, you've got your own atheist expert. Ben Watkins here is an expert philosopher, and he's using a kind of reverse, the same type of logic. So there you go. It is valid. It is sound. Well, it is valid. I will say that. Obviously, I disagree with the possibility premise there, but yeah.
Right on. Okay, Ben, here's the next one. How would a universal judgment of sin under the assumption of none are good, followed by a future universal repeal of the judgment in lieu of individual judgments, affect the calculus?
So I'm not sure. This is a complex question, so I want to make sure that I get all of the pieces of it right. How would a universal judgment of sin under the assumption of none? So no sin is good. Okay, I'm with you there. Universal judgment. So I think that means God's judgment of sin in the end, universally, followed by future universal repeal of the judgment in lieu of. I don't know. Followed by a future universal repeal of the judgment in lieu of individual judgment. I don't know what that means.
All right, we'll move on. It's okay. Hey, look, I understand.
I didn't understand it either. Oh,
Yeah, there you go. I actually have a response to this free will in heaven notion. One could say that we freely ask God to remove our ability to sin, which means that we freely chose not to sin. This is a good one. I mean, this is one that we could talk about for a second here, because I think it deserves a good response.
So I think in the end, that possibility won't make much of a difference to what the objection's driving at. So the objection said, so what drives the objection is that there is no evil in heaven. So we can ask, okay, well, if there's no evil in heaven, are we significantly free? And so we might say, yes, if we're significantly free in heaven and there's no evil in heaven, then significant freedom is not the reason why we see evil. And so that soul building theodicy would fail for that reason. Or we could say there is no significant freedom in heaven. And that's why there's no evil in heaven. Okay. Well, if significant freedom was not necessary to achieve a really good state, like heaven is better than the actual world. Well, so the claim is that we needed significant freedom in order to make the best possible world that we could. Well, if that's not true, if there's a possible world like heaven, if it's metaphysically possible for us to achieve those ends, those really great goods without significant freedom, then the soul building theodicy fails for that reason. So, but an important point of this objection is that it only works for people who believe in heaven. So we, in the characterizing claim, only made a claim about God's goodness and God's power, but we haven't added on heaven as some auxiliary hypothesis or some entailment of theism. So it's a perfectly legitimate move for the theist to say that they're not appealing to heaven, and that concept of heaven isn't an auxiliary assumption that need worry their soul building theodicy. So you can this response only works to someone who's already a committed Christian or Muslim or Jew or any other Western religious tradition that has this conception of an afterlife with no suffering in it.
Right. I also think that we will have free will in heaven. I believe it's going to be more of a progressional state where we've went through this life through our actions and our basically ticket to heaven. We get to the state like C.S. Lewis describes in The Great Divorce, where we don't choose to sin. We don't do that anymore. The potential, I think, will always be there, but the actuality of it won't. Oh, he's gonna sneeze again. No.
Sorry, guys. I have my dryer broke, and so I got a new heater element for it. And so I went in and replaced it today and did all the vacuuming of all the dust. And I've just been, man, it's wrecked me.
Dude, it will. Dude, I have to clean my basement a lot because I got 2 dogs down here. And if I don't have the air purifier on, it just gets so dusty.
Oh man.
It's so dusty.
Well, we have 6 cats. And
Woo!
so
yeah.
the pet danger is real around here.
I got 3 dogs and a cat. So
zoo. You're like me. Zoo.
Yeah, dude. Bro, I would have a rescue if I had enough land. I love animals, bud. But yeah, man, I'm gonna leave it there. I think you answered enough. We've had you on here for a while. It was a great time as always, and I'm really looking forward to presenting my theodicy to you to see if I cover a lot of these bases, and you can critique me if you'd like as well, and tell me what areas that maybe I can improve on. That's one of the things I want to bring you back on for, so we can go over it. So, but yeah, I appreciate it. Dale, do you have any more for Ben here?
Questions?
Yeah, anything. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how we're doing for time and stuff like that.
We're getting close. I'm sure we're about 1:45 in. So
okay, so I'll make them quick ones. Okay, so one you mentioned about unjustified evils, and an example of that were inscrutable evils were unjustified because we can't scrutinize what is. Or no?
Not quite. So there's a difference between unjustified evils and inscrutable evils. So unjustified evils are evils that God would not be justified in allowing, but an inscrutable evil is one that we just can't discern a God justifying reason for God to allow it. So a lot of people will infer unjustified evils from inscrutable evils.
Yeah.
And that's the move specifically that skeptical theism is trying to block. So the example was William Rowe's fawn that dies in a forest fire and languishes for several days before it dies. And so we can ask, is this an unjustified evil? What could the God justifying reason be for allowing this sort of evil? And so we would say that's an inscrutable evil. We can't discern what the God, and so, but there is a movement from we can't discern any God justifying reason for allowing this evil to this is actually an unjustified evil.
So that's what my question wanted to be about, especially with that example that you give, because couldn't it be that we do know enough? We have sufficient scrutable knowledge that there are cause and effect relationships, even with that deer out in the middle of nowhere. Look, bugs are going to start eating that thing. Maybe a bunch of worms are going to start eating that, and then they're going to be exposed. And the birds are going to see them. They're going to fly and try to eat the worms. And maybe along the way, one of them takes a dump and that lands on Albert Einstein's head and he gets upset. And because of that, he was about to be saved with a street preacher, but he tells him to get lost. And because of that, he never becomes a Christian. Like that, we can always play those kinds of scenarios. So like, couldn't we say, well, we do know enough to know that we have finite knowledge about all of these cause and effect relationships. And we know that things, like the butterfly effect is a thing and stuff like that. Wouldn't that be enough to kind of justify that? Yeah, we can have faith that in the skeptical theism defense, that there are cause and effect relationships way beyond us, especially going into the future and stuff.
Well, so the first thing I want to point out is that all of the examples that you gave of good things that could come from the deer, sustaining certain insect or avian species, or a butterfly effect where there's causal connections between the body of this fawn and really good events in the future, maybe involving Albert Einstein or some sort of conversion. And I'm willing to concede all of that. But the question is the pain and suffering of the fawn? Was the pain and suffering that the fawn experienced logically necessary for any of that? So the sustenance that these insect and avian species get, it's not clear to me that any of its pain of that deer contributed to any of those good things. When we think about the butterfly effect of the causal effects into distant future, it's not clear to me that any of the pain, the conscious pain the animal suffered, the morally relevant feature, was logically necessary for it. And so that's the part of it that I think is inscrutable, because it just seems like, look, this just seems entirely gratuitous. This seems unnecessary. This seems like something that God could have all these really, really great ends that you're achieving, but he would also have the power to achieve those ends using means that were not so inevitably cruel and involve so much pain.
Just one quick follow-up there, because I noticed the way you said that it's not logically necessary to arrive here. But I would argue that I think we can make a case that it's factually necessary to arrive at the ends. Given we're in this fallen world, it is factually necessary. Would that make a difference, or do you think that even making that move doesn't work?
Well, so you have to think about the limits in the characterizing claim that we put on God's power. We said that what does omnipotence entail? We said it doesn't entail contradictions. So we put logical limits on God, and those were the only limits that we put on God. So when I say, is this evil logically necessary for some greater good, or the prevention of some evil equally bad or worse? What I'm saying is that God's power had no other way of achieving that end except through these means. Like, it was, as a matter of logic, it was logically necessary for William Rose Fawn to die in the forest fire and languish for several days. That's logically necessary to achieve whatever the good end that it is that God has. And I think that we can obviously see the implausibility of that, because we're like, well, look, we could obviously achieve all of these really good ends in ways that don't involve a butterfly effect or don't involve the horrendous suffering of this fawn. It doesn't seem like there's any logical limit to God's power that would prevent him from stopping this particular instance of suffering. So that's where I'm getting the logical relation, is because in the characterizing claim, we only limited God's power to logical necessity, not factual necessity. So we might say, well, factually it's the case. Well, God's power is not limited by what's factually the case. God could suspend, say, like the laws of nature, or what are called, nomenological laws, the laws that describe the way the world is. These are things that God's not constrained by. He's not constrained by these contingent facts.
Wouldn't
Gotcha.
he be constrained in a way if the theology of the fallen world and all that is true, and the fact that he created a certain world in which would have this biodiversity? He would be constrained, because if he did step in all the time, albeit unless it was necessary for him to step in, wouldn't that change the nature of reality, and we wouldn't have a world really we're living in anyway? We wouldn't have the same reality that we have, if he did do all that, and that would kind of like disrupt everything. Do you think that could be a thing there?
So, well, it obviously any supposition that we make about God or this could have, potential implications, like
Right,
you're
yeah.
mentioning. What I would want to take note of and draw our attention to is the idea that we are now adding something to the characterizing claim. We are adding the fall. So
Right.
if we were
Okay.
able to
Okay, I see what you're
add
saying.
yeah, if we were able to add the fall on independent grounds, if we were
Right.
able to say something that was not part of the characterizing claim, like if there was, I know this isn't the case. I'm not
Yeah,
suggesting that this is
absolutely. No,
possible.
I know what you're talking about. So
Yeah.
even if we added something like the biodiversity of life and all that, I mean, we're adding more to the characterization claim, and that's not
No,
kind
no,
of
no, the fall. If we add the
yeah,
fall, because
yeah,
we have to ask, like, why do we believe in the fall? Like if we're saying
yeah,
that, like,
of
that's
course.
a part of our model here, is there some experiment that we've done? If is there some observation that we've made to say that, like, man is in a state of rebellion against God? No, that's something that we get from the theology.
Yeah,
And so it's something, and again, in the characterizing claim, all we've done is give God an unembodied mind, and we've
yeah,
increased his power and motivation infinitely.
yeah,
But now we have to add something else to the model. We have to add this, that God created us for the purpose of falling away into a to see the biodiversity that we observe. And he did all of this so that he could send his son to atone for our
yeah.
sins and offer us salvation to defeat
And that
evil
would
in
be a
the end.
theodicy. We'd end up in a theodicy, right?
Yeah,
Right.
no, yeah, and yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, this would be
yeah,
part
exactly.
of a theodicy. Like,
Yep,
this would be
absolutely.
something additional that's being added to the model. That in itself is not objectionable if you can give independent grounds for that move. If you can't give independent grounds on that move, you're open to the charge of question begging, because what reason do we have to believe that we live in a fallen state? Well, you can't say because Christianity is true, because that presupposes God's existence. Well, God's existence is the very thing that the problem of evil is challenging. So we can't make the assumption that we live in a fallen world because the Christian God exists, because that presupposes the thing in question.
That
All right.
that oh, go ahead, David.
No, go. No, go ahead, Dale.
Okay, I was gonna say, and I agree with you on the logical stuff versus the factual necessity. That's why I would argue based on metaphysical necessity and that sort of thing. But one thing you just said brings up the question I was trying to ask you originally, and I mucked it up. I didn't ask it right, but it's on the burden of proof, right? So that the way I see it, the atheist, if you're making the claim based on the problem of evil that God doesn't exist, you've got a burden of proof. Why couldn't a Christian submit, like, as a, again, that undercutting defeater? Like, well, what if Christian theism is true? What if Islamic theism is true, or whatever? Like, you can submit all these things without taking on a burden of proof, and it's on you then, the one making the claim, to disprove all these things as improbable options and stuff. Yeah.
So I think you're quite right that um, the atheist has a burden of justification here. And in fact, his burden of justification is threefold. He has to justify a characterizing claim, he has to justify a link, and he has to justify a datum. And so another question arises, and this is one of the few places where I think that the logical problem of the distinction between logical and evidential arguments from evil becomes useful. Because it's often said about logical arguments from evil that just the mere possibility of some premise that's being appealed to being false is enough to diffuse the problem. And I don't think that's right. I think actually what it is that sets the standard for a successful argument way too high, because there are people who are willing to deny the law of non-contradiction. Like that, if we're just saying that like we can only appeal to premises that everyone will accept, well, there are people willing to deny the law of non-contradiction. So there's no such thing as a premise that all parties can concede. And so to set the standard of evidence that high is just too unreasonably high. So the types of premises that we can appeal to are ones that are reasonable to believe. And so what are premises are reasonable to believe will also depend on people's epistemic positions. So some proposition might be more reasonable for someone to believe at a certain time than someone else. So this idea of reasonable belief gives us that kind of flexibility that we think comes along with the rationality of beliefs, the ways that people's different perspectives and the ways in which their judgment and cognitive faculties are functioning. All of these are just relevant to making these sorts of judgments. So I think that the atheist cannot in any way get away with saying, like, I have no burden of justification here. They can't say that. They have at least that threefold burden of justification. However, I don't think for their argument to go through, for the standard for a successful argument is that the person putting forward the argument for evil must refute all of the other possible responses to it. The idea is that you want some sort of balance between the antecedent plausibility of the premises and the form in which the argument takes. So obviously we want our arguments to have logically valid forms, but we also want to appeal to premises that largely most people can accept. Like when people look at them, they go, yeah, that's antecedently credible. I can see why someone would find that a reasonable claim to believe. And so arguments are not weapons. These are not things that we should be using to try to refute people or silence people. Or these are tools. These are tools to help us in our journeys. And these problems have significant implications for how our philosophy will adapt to accommodate these problems. So we all have our own worldviews. Those were the beliefs and structures of those systems fit together in very intricate ways. And when we discover tensions or discover new informations, that worldview has to shift. It has to move. Well, the ways in which it moves, the ways in which it shifts will depend on how clearly we've thought about these problems. What are the things that are important to us in our model of God that we're not willing to sacrifice? And what are pieces that we are willing to sacrifice? So to give you an example, like some theists might want to respond to the problem of evil in a way that doesn't undermine their solution to the problem of divine providence or divine foreknowledge and human freedom. They want to in some way preserve their intuition. You don't want to solve one problem at the risk of making some other problem bigger. And so I think what these tools really come down to, what are used the most, are for motivating people who are thinking about these questions in serious ways of how they can adjust their models. How can their model worldviews adapt to all of these interesting problems that are raised, not only by the problem of evil, but by other problems, by the problem of divine hiddenness. On the atheist side, like how do you respond to a cosmological argument? How do you respond to a teleological argument? These are arguments that are in the space for us to use to design, do we need to assert that the universe is necessary, or can we say that it's a brute fact? No, it depends on what we think is important in our response to a cosmological argument or a teleological argument. And so that's what I think the real use of these arguments is for, is not, you have a burden of proof, so you have to meet this or it fails. I think that's more of using arguments as weapons.
Right.
Or the goal should be progress. The goal should be resolving of disagreement and trying to bring the world closer into human understanding, so that more of it is intelligible to us. And this is one of the reasons why I don't really like the skeptical theist move to the problem of evil, is because it basically just concedes the mystery. It just embraces the mystery and says, this is unintelligible to us. Now, granted, at some point we have to just say some things are unintelligible. Or, as I think is the case, some things are intelligible. It's just a really crummy conclusion, like that the universe is indifferent to our existence. I would find it much more religiously satisfying if I didn't think that the universe was indifferent to finite creatures, lives of finite creatures, because I can't make intelligible things like bone cancer or the Holocaust. These are considerations that pushed me into the atheist naturalist camp because I just couldn't square it. And to just be skeptical and to just say, oh, well, it's unintelligible, it's just beyond human understanding. That was, it was more intelligible to say the universe was indifferent than to say it's just a mystery.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Right on. Well, guys, we are at the end here. Ben, I think you said that last part well, so yes, thanks for that. It is all about us coming together, right? And discussing these ideas and stuff like that. And we're really, again, privileged to have you on the show, given that presentation and everything. Where can people find you? And if they want to learn more about Real Atheology, where can they, pick up your channel?
Yeah, so again, we're Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. We have a YouTube channel, Facebook page, Twitter page. We're available wherever you listen to podcasts, whether it be Apple, Spotify, whatever. We have a presence on all of them. Look us up, shoot us a message sometime, and stay tuned. We've got a lot of good content in 2024 having to do with David Hume.
Right on. Right on.
Woohoo.
Dale, just give us a quick plug and then we're out of here, guys.
Yeah, cool. So, I'm at Real Seekers on plural with an S on YouTube or Rumble Video and Spotify, all those places. My blog is realseekerministries.wordpress.com, where I post up blogs with sources to the shows that I do. And I guess tomorrow I do have another show, once again on the Shroud with Bob Rucker, who's a nuclear engineer, and Hugh Ferry, who Ben knows because he debated him on the resurrection. Oh, you're muted.
I said I'm also a nuclear engineer. It's wild that you just said that. Like, what are the odds? I'm dead serious.
Oh my goodness, you and Jordan are both okay. Great. Well, I don't know. You're not into the Shroud, but if you ever do get into it, you should come on and have a discussion with Bob Rucker. So, all right.
Right
Awesome.
on. Well,
thank you so much for having me on. This was so
yeah.
much fun. It was an honor to get to come on. And
Absolutely.
So the presentation I've given tonight is probably 5 or 6 years old. That has evolved over that time too. So this is a living presentation. Like, as my studies take me deeper and deeper into the problem of evil, this presentation just keeps getting richer and richer. So this was a great opportunity to come and show where my thinking is at these days. I think is a really important, really interesting problem in the philosophy of religion.
Yeah, it's really great. It's one of the reasons I, want to, explore it with my theodicy and stuff like that with my masters and stuff. So, but guys, again, Faith Unaltered will be back here next week. Maybe you'll get more shows because we didn't plan more shows last week, but it happened. So, guys, stay tuned. We got more things coming for you. So, as Tyler would say, God bless. Good night. God bless, and stay like Christ, right? Peace.